For 8 years he had done the same small thing every time his attention wandered. Slide a tiny palm up to the curve of his ear, press, and then tilt his head as if expecting the world to answer back. The motion had become as familiar to him as breathing, more familiar than hearing. In the Hart estate, the rest of the world moved on in noise and music and argument, but inside those walls there was a private silence that even silk curtains and candelabras couldn't soften. The boy's hand against his ear was a quiet rhythm of hope that had never been satisfied. Money had been offered like prayer. The uncle, Oliver Hart, had filled that silence with specialists, machines, consultations that lasted minutes but billed like months. He had sat under fluorescent lights and listened to terms that made him feel both invasive and helpless, irreversible, congenital, permanent. He had agreed to tests that produced neat graphs and images, but not the one thing he wanted most, the sound of his sister's child calling him uncle. He had spent fortunes to bridge a space the world's best doctors said could not be bridged. The ledger of care read like devotion. The ledger of results read like loss. Oliver carried another loss heavier than cost. He kept a photograph in his study, his sister smiling, hair lifted by some seaside wind, a hand on the boy's small shoulder. She had died the year the diagnosis was made, and in the vacuum that followed, he had folded himself into money and decisions and the duty to protect the child he had promised to raise. The silence in the house was not only the boy's, it was an echo of grief that belonged to the uncle too, something Oliver paid others to manage because he could not admit, even to himself, how vacant the quiet made him feel. That mansion, stately on the outside, contained rooms where servants moved like cautious instruments. There was the head housekeeper who organized the impossible schedule of care. There were doctors who arrived and left with polite gravity. And one autumn afternoon, there was a new face among the staff, Mateo Ruiz, hired as a bodyguard. He was neither imposing in the way Hollywood expects, nor soft in the way pity might shape him. He wore cheap shoes and a jacket that couldn't keep up with his steady back. He had come with a credit card stained by months of unpaid hospice bills for his mother, and a promise to ensure that the house's most vulnerable slept safe. Mateo's past was not a story of elite training. It was a story of steady muscle forged in small, serious things. A younger brother he had kept from trouble, late-night drives to a clinic, nights learning how to be present when people were afraid. His hands were calloused but careful. There was a photograph in his wallet too, a woman with a laugh full of forgiveness. Her name was Rosa.
She was the reason he took jobs that others scoffed at, and why, when the agency told him he would be caring for the Hart house, he agreed. He needed the pay. He needed the work. He wanted to keep his mother's care paid for, and he had, secret and stubborn, a soft spot for children who were seen and not heard. From the first week, Mateo noticed the boy's habit. It happened when the child, whose name was Jonah, sat by a tall window watching rain. It happened in the bath, when soap slid like glass, and at the dining table, where everyone spoke and Jonah's lips shaped words that never took sound. Mateo found himself pausing, watching the way the small hand rose and fell. He began to keep a distance that was useful for safety, but intimate enough to be useful for observation. He learned Jonah's small signs. A tilt of the head meant discomfort. A sharp hand to ear meant pain. The language was simple, private, honest. Oliver noticed the attention in a different way. He watched Mateo as he moved through the house, protective, silent, an extra pair of eyes the size of a man. But he did not suspect that anybody in his employ would make the kind of discovery that would rewrite years of professional pronouncements. He was persuaded by credentials, by white coats and diplomas, by the weight of a report stamped with a hospital's name. He had learned to trust the experts because it was less painful than living in the possibility that he'd been wrong. Yet expertise and compassion do not always walk the same path. While the specialists had records and protocols, the boy's body kept its own notes, episodes of irritation, a recurring complaint of fullness, a finger that always found the same inner place. Mateo, who had carried his own small heartbreak and bills and a grandmother's scabbed hand, interpreted those notes with a kind of attention that does not require a clipboard. He noticed textures. He noted how, when Jonah's face tightened, his hand pressed not simply at the ear's outer curve, but deeper, almost as if remembering a pressure that belonged behind the drum of the ear itself. There is a difference between seeing and believing. Mateo saw, then he began to believe. He read the hospital summary in the binder he had to refill once,
a routine task, and his eyes snagged on an entry that felt like a whisper left unread. It was a notation. Possible dense obstruction node, recommended follow-up for removal. It was not flamboyant. It was a line on a crowded page. But for Mateo, the line echoed the boy's small hand. He did what careful people often do first. He asked. He asked the head housekeeper about the note. He asked the nurse who came in for weekly medication routines. Answers were soft, procedural. We asked, they said. We waited. A junior physician had recommended an ENT consult. Somewhere between recommendation and action, the note had faded into the file. Oversight was the polite word. It landed on Mateo like a stone. Oversight.
A failure of follow-through that had not hurt anyone yet, until it had. Mateo's choice was not made in a vacuum. There were rules he knew, protocols for medical intervention, the impossibility of acting without consent, the risks to a career and to his freedom. He had watched programs where unauthorized action in a house like this ended with arrests and courtrooms. But there were more immediate considerations that rang louder than fear. Jonah's nightly grimace, the nights he woke and pressed at his ear until tears smudged the pillow, the small child's trust when he reached for Mateo's sleeve and smiled with a silence. Mateo reflected on Rosa's hands, how they had trembled in hospice when he could not make machines soft. He remembered the look on his mother's face the day he promised to make sure she would never be left unheeded again. That memory was not a justification, it was a compass. The first prayer was a whisper in the pantry. The house was empty then, Oliver away in the city to deal with business that had no end, staff moving in smooth, scheduled rhythms. Mateo had cleaned instruments before, boiled and wrapped things in sterile cloth at a clinic where he volunteered. He was not a doctor. He did not pretend otherwise. He prayed because he needed steadiness that was not his own. Lord, he said under his breath, not to any person, but in the small chapel of his memory, if you will, steady my hands. Help me not to harm what I love to help. What followed was not a step-by-step manual. It cannot be that. The rules of life and responsibility forbid it. Instead, imagine a small scene held between two breaths. Mateo sat with Jonah on a narrow couch. The boy reclined like a rested bird, hair velvet, small hands searching for the world. Mateo called out a few signs he had taught him, the two-finger wave, the pat-pat for good, and Jonah responded with a shy grin. Mateo's hands were careful. He had washed them twice. He had taken from a first aid kit a small, simple instrument that had been used to irrigate and to soothe, never for surgery. He remembered the notation on the scan and the way the boy's fingers lingered in one pocket of the ear. He moved slowly. He spoke aloud the names of things to make a sound he hoped Jonah could feel in his chest. I'm here, he said. I'm with you. The moment held the suspended quality of things beneath prayer. He did not act out of bravado. He acted because the boy was in evident distress, and because the chain of follow-up had been broken by 1,000 small human missteps. He told Jonah what he was about to do in signs and in breath. Jonah looked at him with the patient trust of someone who had been waiting to be listened to for years. Mateo sat steady. He breathed. He did what a mind trained by compassion can do. He reached, guided by what he had seen and by an instinct that had been sharpened not by a diploma but by the discipline of care.
When the obstruction came free, it seemed to fall from some other world into the light. It was small, stubborn, like the kernel of a seed, or a shard of something that had lodged itself where sound was meant to pass. It was not a dramatic talisman. It was a physical thing, ordinary and invasive in its ordinariness. Jonah's face changed. The world that had been only texture and shape cracked, and down into that crack poured a simple, ordinary sound, the tick of a clock in the hall, the distant patter of rain against the window, a muffled voice of a housekeeper asking if they wanted tea. Jonah gasped. It is a small miracle to describe the first sound to someone who has never heard. It is not that light floods in like in a movie. It is more subtle. A new layer of reality arrives, and the body recognizes it, like a remembered name. His brow unknotted. His eyes widened in the way of children who discover a toy hidden for a long time. He turned his head, and in a voice shaped by years of silence and practice, he produced a syllable like an echo that had been rehearsed in his throat. He stuttered the start of the word before the next sound emerged, a consonant finding a place it had never occupied. The room filled with a sound that to Oliver sounded like home. For a breath or two there was only astonishment and rumor of what had happened.
Then the door opened, and the house's machinery of protection kicked into motion. Oliver returned earlier than Matteo expected. He had cut his meeting short, with the kind of abruptness panic breeds. He found his nephew on a couch, cheeks wet and radiant, and Matteo sitting very still beside him. The sight of the child, alive to sound, was a bewilderment that cracked through Oliver's practiced composure. The first thing he did was not to ask how, it was to ask if Jonah was hurt. He looked at Matteo in a way that measured both gratitude and accusation. The house had rules for disorder, and those rules slid into place now. There were shouts in the hall. The head housekeeper arrived with a face grown thin with fear and the urgency of those who manage reputations. Someone said the word unauthorized. Someone else said medic. One of the staff reached for Matteo's arm before he could explain. Professionalism, legal exposure, the fear of a wealthy man's wrath. These are modern things that speak loudly. Matteo answered in the narrow language of facts. The scan noted an obstruction. There was a follow-up recommended that was not completed. The boy had been in pain for years. He told the story the way someone tells the truth when it still tastes of where it came from. Humble, unadorned. Oliver's face was a map of 1,000 decisions. He felt gratitude like a burn. He felt fury like a cold knife. How had his house let this go? How had his promise to his dead sister been handled by people who made their living doing their duty?
The impulse, old and reflexive, was to protect the estate and his name, to put order before human life. His hands trembled. He wanted to call the police, to be seen taking swift action, an instinct that would have punished the very hands that had just offered healing. Matteo's action had been both trespass and rescue. The tension in Oliver was raw. Love and the need to control the narrative braided together. Before any punitive steps could be taken, a phone call arrived from the hospital. The nurse had gone back to the record. She had found the notation, the record had been signed by a junior doctor, had flagged possible dense obstruction. It remained in the file, but with no recorded follow-up. Oversight, said the head of the clinic when she called. A recommended procedure had not been scheduled. There was no malice alleged. There was only the cold arithmetic of things that fall off calendars and out of memory. The revelation did not suddenly sanctify neglect. No single word could. But it shifted the story from willful omission to human fracture. Systems are built by people who sometimes fail. Oliver's chest felt empty in that moment, the kind of emptiness that is not soothed by money. He had placed trust in institutions and in paperwork and in polite procedures. He had presumed that his investment would translate into absolute care. He had not realized the brittle spaces where attention can slip. In a small, private place inside, he recognized his own capacity to outsource presence and to think of love as transactions. When Jonah looked up and said, halting yet clear now, "Uncle," something inside Oliver that had been numb for years cracked with relief and shame. The first impulses fell away. The house still hummed with logistical concern, what legal counsel might say, what public image needed tending. But the human moment punched through the layers. Oliver walked to the couch and, without the fanfare of ceremony, sat. The distance that had been measured by mourning and money softened. He cupped Jonah's small face and felt the newness of listening, the rush of gratitude, and a hard, immediate remorse. "I'm so sorry," he said. It wasn't a rehearsable apology. It was the first honest admission he had allowed himself in years. "I should have been here. I should have listened." There would be questions later. There would be explanations to staff and follow-ups with the hospital. There would be conversations about protocol and about how a note on a chart can become a voice that nobody hears. There would be legal staff and pain staff and the hum of a world that measures outcomes. But in that room, the most urgent repair was a human one. Oliver held Jonah and listened, really listened, to the new sounds of his nephew exploring a world he had only practiced from the outside. Matteo was not immediately vindicated by this. Vindication in real life often arrives in an inconvenient, bureaucratic way.
For a time, Matteo's action was met with suspicion. The fear of what could be called unauthorized medical interference pressed like a weight. Yet the hospital records, pulled after the initial shock, confirmed a recommended follow-up that had not been scheduled. The word used by the medical director was lapse, an unintentional failure in a system that had too many moving parts. There was no indictment of the doctors as villains. There was instead a recognition that even in excellent systems, slip-ups occur, and that when lives are involved, those slips can be catastrophic. Oliver's anger turned to an ache of accountability. He looked at Matteo not as an enemy, but as the person who had done what the system had not. He offered apologies for the suspicion and the quickness to condemn. And then, in a way that surprised everyone who knew his reserve, he publicly acknowledged Matteo's courage. He insisted that no further punitive steps be taken. He arranged for the hospital to review its protocols and to issue a statement that did not villainize, but insisted on better follow-through. He wrote a check to Matteo, not as charity, but as compensation for risk. He also offered Matteo a longer-term position that included better pay and the dignity of trust. The house changed in small ways that mattered. Jonah began to learn how to navigate sound, how to turn it into words, how to ask questions with a tone that matched their meaning. Oliver learned to speak with a gentleness that matched Jonah's new discovery. There were trips to therapists and to sound clinics, and to people who made their living teaching those who had not been given a sound childhood how to use it. Matteo remained a quiet figure at the edge, the kind of person whose life had been rearranged by a single choice. He used his pay to help his mother's care and to keep a small savings for a future that no longer felt as tenuous. People told stories about Jonah's first word for a long time. The narrative bent toward moral clarity. A poor, humble bodyguard did what many educated hands had not. A child was restored. An uncle was forced into vulnerability and then into repentance. The simplest truth undergirded the story. God uses unlikely hands. It is not that God cannot act through the powerful or the credentialed. It is that grace often arrives via the places we least expect, via a neighbor, via a hands-on stranger, via the person whose name is not on any hospital brochure, but who has been faithful in the small, invisible duties of life. There was another layer to what happened, one that Oliver could not ignore. He had spent years trying to answer a child's need with every instrument money could buy, and yet he had not given himself to noticing the rhythms of the boy's daily life. In the end, it was presence that mattered more than payment. The scene forced him to reckon with how his grief had hardened into an avoidance that he mistook for prudence.
He could fix many things with money, but presence is not a commodity. It must be practiced. The household, too, had lessons. Protocols were reviewed. Records were reorganized. The hospital instituted a system to flag any entry that recommended intervention but did not have a scheduled follow-up. People used the word lapse now with sober faces, and it felt different, less like an excuse and more like an admission the world needs to hear. We are capable of neglect, even within our best institutions. On a late afternoon months later, Matteo sat on a bench in the estate garden while Jonah kicked a ball nearby. Sound filled the air in accidental orchestration, a bird's bright call, the ripple of the fountain, the laugh of a child newly learning the cadences of language. Matteo watched the way Jonah's face lit up when he realized he could make the sound la, and then the sound ball, and then combine them. The boy looked at him and mouthed, Matteo, trying the syllables like a new shirt he was testing for fit. Matteo felt the shape of his chest, where gratitude and relief nested. Oliver came out of the house, and for the first time in a long while, he walked slowly, intentionally. He sat beside Matteo and listened to the child play with noise as it were a toy discovered under a sofa. "You saved him," Oliver said with bluntness that was not edged by ceremony. There was no fanfare in the words, only a steady human thank you. Matteo shook his head. "We just did what had to be done," he said. He did not pretend to be brave. He did not claim a prize. He had done what anyone with the courage to act would have done. There was no sermon in his voice, only the humble admission of a man who had been faithful in the quiet duties of life. Oliver's repentance was not spectacle. He apologized to the staff who had been blamed prematurely. He visited the clinic to speak with administrators about ways to prevent similar lapses, and he bought Jonah a small, cheap radio, not an extravagant thing, a child's toy, so that the boy could practice with simple sounds at home. He took days out of his schedule to sit and be present, to try and learn how not to let grief drive him into the arms of avoidance.
In the months that followed, the household settled into a new pattern. Jonah learned to listen with the delight of someone who had discovered a map to an unseen country. Matteo continued to work, paying his bills and visiting his mother, who learned to hum old lullabies and wanted to know every new word Jonah had learned. Oliver learned to measure his success not just in portfolios, but in the quality of hours he gave to the child and the people around him. Sometimes, when the evening lights turned the manicured hedges into silhouettes, Oliver would stand at Jonah's doorway and wait for the little hand that once pressed at his ear to reach for him.
The boy would come, and Oliver would listen to him tell with the clipped, proud newness of a child who had just learned language about the noises of the day. A dog that barked like a laugh, the caw of a crow that sounded to him like an old clock, the distant murmur of traffic that sounded to Oliver now like the whole city breathing. This is not a story that promises miracles for all, nor does it hold up Matteo as an example for risky or reckless behavior. It is a story that honors compassion and the often unremarkable courage that surfaces when the needs of another person are more pressing than the fear of consequence. It asks us to think about how we respond when the systems meant to protect us fall silent with their own lapses. It points to a truth that is not theological jargon, but simple human wisdom, that sometimes love arrives through hands that do not carry diplomas, and that those hands deserve dignity, not dismissal. There are harder questions here too. How many other notations have simply been filed and forgotten? How often do we let trust in institutions replace the work of bearing witness to a neighbor's pain? The answers are not easy, and the solutions are not purely spiritual. They demand accountability, better systems, and yes, a moral resolve to notice when someone's hand goes again and again to the place it hurts. Before I close, a small invitation. If this story has stirred something in you, hope, indignation, gratitude, take a moment to let it land. Share the story with someone who needs a reminder that compassion matters. Consider how you might support caregivers in your own community, those who, like Matteo, work quietly and often underappreciated. And now a brief prayer. Lord, thank you for the hands that do not seek praise. Guide us to see the overlooked and to act with courage and humility. Help us to be people who notice, who follow through, and who love in ways that repair what has been broken. Miracles, when they come, are often simple. They are small acts joined to great mercy. In the hush that followed Jonah's first words, the house learned that sound could mend what silence had fractured. Relationships, trust, the unspoken promises we make to each other. Above all, they learned that God sometimes chooses the most unexpected hands to open the world for us again. If this moved you, share it with someone who needs hope. Tell us in the comments about a quiet person who changed your life, and consider supporting a local caregiver or charity that helps families in need.